How come I'm not getting any? It's because no one's talking.
He's not here yet.
Hi, everyone. Hope everyone is doing well this evening. This is the Canadian Foreign Policy Hour. I am coming to you from Jojage, which has long been a meeting place of various First Nations, otherwise known as Montreal. And I have a hard 7 o'clock out this evening, so probably should get right to it. Sorry, just working on a couple of technical things here. So to begin with, the Peruvian Congress appears to have accepted foreign troops in the country, and there's talk of as many as 700 U.S. troops being dispatched to Peru to train Peruvian forces. Of course, this follows the ouster of the elected president back in December, which the Canadian government has supported. And Amnesty International or Amnesty Canada put out a statement saying that Canada shouldn't be arming Peru. And there's an article kind of talking about that in the context of the CANSEC that's taking place this week. Alexandre Boulris, the NDP MP, only NDP MP here in Quebec, put a statement on Twitter of the Amnesty a statement, and sorry, I'm getting a lot of noise from my son, and so So Boulris put out this tweet, which I found, it's obviously a good thing that he's echoing what Amnesty is saying about Canada ending arms sales to this government that is a usurper government. But I think it's pretty odd that the NDP has not said anything about the ouster of Pedro Castillo and Canada, more specifically Canada's role in backing that diplomatically, but that's the way it is. CANSEC, the big arms festival, arms fair, is taking place this week in Ottawa. I know there are protests planned on Wednesday early in the morning when the Defense Minister Anita Anand is going to be speaking at the CANSEC.
This is good stuff.
Sorry, I'm trying to, if people can try to mute themselves, I've tried to do that, but I'm not sure if some people I think have unmuted before I changed the thing. So if people could try to mute themselves, that'd be great. So Anita Anand will be speaking at CANSEC. CANSEC's put on by CADC, which is the big arms lobbying group in Canada that receives a whole bunch of different forms of government support, which is always important to keep in mind. And there will be huge numbers of Department of National Defense and other government officials at this arms fair, and trying to sort of both purchase weapons, also help Canadian companies sell weapons to other countries. And anyone who's in Ottawa, very much, if you can get out to the protests, which are starting early in the morning on the 31st, I strongly suggest doing that. In the Ottawa Citizen, David Puglisi today has a piece about how the Canadian Special Forces leaders were warned about so-called untouchable soldiers who have escaped punishment for wrongdoing. So I guess there's some of the elite Canadian special forces have engaged in wrongdoing, and they're basically untouchable, according to this story. Now, of course, the whole special forces, a big part of what it's all about is just being able to deploy them secretly abroad and not having to tell anyone. So the fact that they even internally, there's discussion about some of these special forces being untouchable, that's, I think, particularly troubling. The World Socialist website has a story titled, "Trudeau government orchestrates massive growth in partnerships between Canadian military and universities." And it documents all these examples of funding to different university programs, mostly through the Department of National Defense's Mines program, which they set up a couple years ago, I think back in 2017 with their defense policy statement. And they fund just all kinds of different academic initiatives, both in the social sciences realm, but also in the sort of more applied science, more sort of at a technological level. They also support, security studies programs and try to have sort of basically academic lobbyists for the military through the Mines program. And even groups like Project Plowshares have been funded through Mines, which I think Project Plowshares sort of monitors Canadian arms industry. And I think that the DND wants to have a little bit of leverage on Project Plowshares and sort of the peace kind of the establishment kind of peace world. And I think that's why they would fund a Project Plowshares. Anyways, the World Socialist website, it's very a good story, go detailing some of this stuff out. In Saturday's National Post, there's a column titled "Kissinger's Remarkable 100 Years." And that got me thinking about Melanie Joly when she took a picture with Henry Kissinger not long ago. Of course, Henry Kissinger turned 100 a couple of days ago. And so there's been a bit of attention about, some of what Kissinger's done. I'm far from any sort of expert on Henry Kissinger's, war crimes. But I thought I'd go through a few that Canada was sort of complicit with. First of all, with regards to East Timor and the Kissinger green-lighted Suharto's 1975 invasion in East Timor that led to just hundreds of thousands being killed in a country. I think something like towards like a quarter of the population ends up getting wiped out by the Indonesians. And Canada provided arms to the Indonesians during all of this. The Canadian foreign minister seems to have been basically aware, was sort of asked about it by Suharto beforehand, and seems to have sort of just sort of said, "We don't have a problem. That's your business. If you invade." Canadian votes the UN. I think one of them actually they opposed a resolution, but for the most part they abstained on resolutions criticizing Indonesia's occupation of East Timor. Another of Kissinger's crimes that Canada was complicit in is with regards to the ouster of Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973. Kissinger said, he was quoted saying, I don't see why we need to stand by and watch a country go communist due to the irresponsibility of its people. The issues are much too important for the Chilean voters to be left to decide for themselves." So that's Kissinger saying, who cares about democracy? Who cares about what Chileans think? This is part of the US empire, and we're going to do what we want to do. And of course, they destabilized Allende, and then they backed Pinochet's coup and assassination. And Canada backed that. The Trudeau government supported cutting off economic relations, supported cutting off IMF loans to Allende. And then immediately after Allende was overthrown, they supported IMF loans to the Pinochet and supported Export Development Canada credits. And most infamously, the Canadian ambassador in Santiago referred to the riffraff of the Latin American left that was being held and killed at the famous football stadium, and that Pinochet it was sobering Chile up. That was the just mass repression was sobering Chile up from the riffraff of the Latin American left. So Canada backed Kissinger on that issue. And Kissinger also played an important role in prolonging the U.S. war in Southeast Asia and Vietnam, usually referred to as Vietnam, but it was obviously much more broad than that, and the horrible massacres in Cambodia. And Canada backed the U.S. war in Vietnam in different ways. Major arms sales, tens of thousands of Canadians that fought with Americans in Vietnam. Through the International Control Commission, the Canada represented the West in initiative going back to the 50s to bring peace, supposedly to bring peace to Vietnam. And Kissinger, one of the things he did was he went at Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked the Pentagon Papers, went at him hard and tried to totally discredit him and go at his psychologist and all kinds of stuff, horrible stuff like that. The Pentagon Papers showed that the Canadian International Control Commission officials were delivering U.S. bombing threats to the North Vietnamese in 64 and 65, and basically Pearson okayed in meeting with Johnson, the U.S. president, delivering the bombing threats. So Canadian officials to the ICC would go to the North Vietnamese and say, if you don't do this, we, meaning the U.S., will bomb you. And they ultimately did, killed about 100,000 people in the bombing campaigns in North Vietnam, which was just a small fraction of the overall three or so million killed. But Canada was directly complicit in that. And that's why Noam Chomsky considers Lester Pearson a war criminal. So Canada was complicit in a number of Kissinger's crimes. And right up until today, Melanie Joly celebrates Kissinger, and Canadian media celebrate him. So the Canadian government and the Saudi government restarted ambassadors. They announced ambassadors to each other's countries a couple of days ago, which had been kind of the diplomatic relations had put on kind of pause for a few years since 2018, when there was a kerfuffle over a criticism that Canada made of Saudi human rights record. And the whole Saudi thing was, I think, very much exaggerated. I'm kind of ambivalent about the restarting of full diplomatic relations. I think that's generally a good thing. I think generally just maintaining diplomatic relations, kind of no matter what, is probably the proper thing to do. The diplomatic relations, I think, was exaggerated, and the more important element should have been is the arms sales. That's much more important to end the Canadian arms sales, and that never really ended, right? The Trudeau government kind of paused new arms permits. They continued the sales, the light armored vehicle sale that they had okayed early on in their mandate. Those sales continued. They put a pause to new arms sales for a while, but basically all that happened was the permits backed up, and then immediately once they shifted gears on that, most of those permits were okayed, and the Canadian arms sales continued, restarted in full force a couple of years ago. And I think that the restarting of full diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia, the element that I think is probably the positive element in this is I think it's partly tied to the general Saudi trying to sort of stabilize their diplomatic relations, most importantly with Iran, which I think is a good thing. And I think that the Canadian element kind of fit in part within that broader shift of Saudi foreign policy. So the the Globe published a piece a couple days ago, basically from this U.S. group that's funded by Sheldon Adelson's foundation and tied to the AIPAC, the U.S. pro-Israel lobby group, basically going after relations between Canadian and Iranian universities, and they want to try to, shut down all research relations between Canadian academics and Iranian academics, which I think is a negative thing, and it's fits within this whole pushing of conflict with Iran that is not a positive. The Iranians and the Taliban look like there was some fighting a couple of days ago. I saw people on Twitter point out that two things that are kind of interesting on that front. That one person suggesting that the U.S. leaving all this weaponry in Afghanistan, which was sort of framed very negatively, the Taliban got control of all this U.S. weaponry, basically suggesting that maybe the point was actually to get the Taliban weapons so they could get into a fight with Iran. I wouldn't put that past the Americans. And the other thing that someone pointed out was that if the Taliban is into getting into a fight with Iran, that all of a sudden all the money that the Americans have frozen of Afghan funds, that it's likely that all that will be unfrozen really quickly, and they will back the Taliban if they're willing to wage conflict with the Iranians. So on well, sorry, I wanted to show a clip, a video where I interviewed. Yeah. So, anyways, I want to show a clip of asking Rachel Brendian, which is a Liberal MP here in Montreal, about who a couple of weeks ago she sort of attacked in a foreign affairs parliamentary meeting. She attacked the NDP for putting out a motion to criticizing or calling on the Canadian government to stop arms sales to Israel and to ban products from illegal settlements. And I asked the Liberal MP if she agreed with Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch that Israel was committing the crime of apartheid, and her reaction was kind of funny. She just ignored the question and went on. There's a number of good and bad developments on the Palestine front this week. One good development is that B'nai B'rith and the Canadian Union of Postal Workers won their legal suit against B'nai B'rith, or at least they came to an agreement with B'nai B'rith, and B'nai B'rith had to take down a statement that had accused CUPW of supporting terrorism because they cooperated with Palestinian postal workers, and pay an undeclared amount of money to the union. So it was a small legal victory against B'nai B'rith. And there was a number of these that have now piling up. I think Dimitri Lascaris also won a similar type decision. There was a little bit of a brouhaha over the so-called Israeli diaspora minister. I don't know how you pronounce his name, but Imikai Chikli, who is coming to Canada this week. And there's a bit of a kerfuffle because it appears that he did so in a way that went against normal diplomatic relations, and he was going to meet with some far-right evangelical Christian groups and a non-official Canadian, I think Canada-Israel Allies Caucus, I think is what it's called, that's headed by Leslie, a conservative MP. I'm forgetting her first name or her last name. And so it appears that Global Affairs kind of pushed back on this, and it led to a little bit of a sort of division on this. And even Housefather, Anthony Housefather, the head of the Canada-Israel Parliamentary Friendship Group, he sort of criticized this decision to come and meet. And this is like one of those far-right, homophobic ministers, obviously openly Jewish supremacist ministers in the current Israeli government. And CJPME, Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, put out a hard statement criticizing the minister's visit and calling for her to not be no politicians to meet with them. At the World Health Assembly, Canada was one of 13 countries to vote against health conditions in the occupied Palestinian territory, a resolution on health conditions in the occupied Palestinian territory, on the grounds that it politicized the issue. So this is just a continuation of Canada's policy of voting against so many different UN resolutions on Palestinian rights. And very troubling stuff. There was a huge kerfuffle over Roger Waters' concert in Berlin on Twitter. All the Israeli government just started attacking Roger Waters and all of their allies all around the world jumped in, including all of the pro-Israel groups here in Canada, Irwin Kotler, Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center, Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs. They all labeled this thing anti-Semitic. And the thing they labeled anti-Semitic was that he named Shireen Abu Akleh, the Palestinian journalist killed, and Anne Frank's name. And they put these images of the two names next to each other and implied that he was saying that the Israeli government is Nazi-like, that he was just sort of undermining what happened to Anne Frank. Well, even if he had just put the two names next to each other, I think there would be nothing wrong with that, personally. But in fact, there was like 12 different names, all kinds of people who've been killed by authoritarian governments or state violence, and it was just like totally absurd, this claim on that front. Then the second part they freaked out about was that he was in a sort of fascist SS-like attire in his performance. Well, this is something he's been doing since the wall back like 40 years ago. I guess Bob Geldof, or whatever his name is, played this in a movie back in 1982. So this has been something that's been part of Waters' shows, and it's not a pro-Nazi thing. It's a anti-fascist, anti-Nazi skit. But there's all this, this is anti-Semitic. And this just confirmed to me what I wrote this 7 years ago in this article, saying anti-Semitism is the most abused term in Canada today. That's what I wrote back in 2016. I was vilified for this article for writing this. And this Roger Waters thing just confirms it. I mean, it's just like, it's a mockery. It's complete contrived outrage by these Israel lobby, by the apartheid lobby groups. And they whipped up a huge storm. Now they're trying to shut down his concerts in England and elsewhere. The German police have opened an investigation, and you just have all these, the Liberal MPs in Canada, that Sachs, the one in Toronto, calling this anti-Semitism from Roger Waters, and it's all, quite frankly, just a joke. I mean, they are making a complete mockery of the term anti-Semitism. As the Africa for Palestine people, they have a T-shirt that they pointed out, something to the effect of, if you haven't been called anti-Semitic, you're not doing enough for the Palestinian cause. And that's how we have to, unfortunately, that's how we have to look at claims of anti-Semitism. Assume it means someone's doing something in favor of justice, and that's just the sort of reality of where things have gone. Another video, I actually had 3 different clips I wanted to play for you, but I can't seem to find them. The second clip I wanted to play for you was of me interrupting a talk by Stephen Bronfman, who is the lead fundraiser for Justin Trudeau. And Bronfman back in 2013, 2014, in a Globe Mail article, he boasted how he brought Trudeau to Israel, how he was the article talked about how Harper had become very pro-Israel, and that Jewish community financial support had kind of gone more to the conservatives, and that Bronfman was appointed or became the head of the fundraising for the Liberals, for Trudeau, partly to sort of bring back sort of pro-Israel support for Trudeau. And also Bronfman, promoted birthright. And the Bronfman family, of course, has a long history of supporting Zionism and anti-Palestinian. So I interrupted Bronfman at this event, this event that was co-sponsored by the Jewish National Fund, but it was actually an environmental event here in Montreal. And I interrupted him, and I interrupted him on the angle of asked him basically if he was an anti-Palestinian racist. But before intervening, I debated quite a bit. I thought about whether I should actually raise the question of foreign interference, right? And frame my intervention more from the angle of foreign interference. And like, should we view Bronfman explicitly saying he's taking Trudeau to Israel, and that he's fundraising for Trudeau in part for Trudeau to take a anti-Palestinian line? Should we frame that as foreign interference? Now, it's a complicated one, of course, obviously, as Bronfman's a Canadian, so that one element. But he's clearly also tied into the Israel lobby and to Israel specifically, and is exchanging financial contributions for Trudeau's position on a foreign country. And if it was a Chinese Canadian doing that, we would or the Globe and Mail certainly would frame that as a form of foreign interference. It's a tricky and a kind of a interesting kind of thing to think about and sort of explore. Anyways, I can't show you the clip, but it's on Twitter. It's gotten pretty good circulation. And that gets us to, I think, quite frankly, a bombshell, an absolute bombshell in this whole foreign interference question that came down on Tuesday, went completely against what I expected, which was that the special rapporteur on foreign interference, the former Harper Governor General, basically said it doesn't add up. Doesn't add up. We don't need a public inquiry because there's the evidence of the Liberals not doing, not following what the intelligence agencies were asking for. Isn't clear, and the much more important part politically, not from a partisan standpoint, from macro geopolitics, was that these allegations, the Globe and Mail and Global News, that were reportedly based upon leaks from intelligence agency, they were bogus. They're not substantiated. The $250,000 claim of the Chinese providing $250,000 for election stuff, not substantiated. The Han Dong pushing to have keep the 2 Michaels in jail, not substantiated. The business about the conservative MP Michael Chong, the conservative foreign critic, and his family being intimidated in Hong Kong, not substantiated. And a series of other ones, of the big allegations that are just all over the media, not substantiated. And this was incredible. Like, everyone thought this was going to, the political ethos was you have to have an inquiry, and this is China bad, China, and this went completely against that grain. Now, the whole media apparatus that's been pushing this that should have incredible egg on its face, has just basically continued on. They freaked out, had a total panic about the conclusions, but they've basically continued on. Today, incredibly, shockingly, the NDP today is doubling down on their complete alignment with the military-industrial complex, intelligence agency, the U.S. empire, in their contained China policy. And today, the NDP announced that they are calling for Johnson, the special rapporteur, to step aside. So they are basically joining this like ludicrous conservative party, Pierre Poilievre, like the most kind of like childish, Johnson is a skiing buddy of Justin Trudeau, and it's all this is all Trudeau's buddy, letting him off the hook. And the NDP has joined this completely today and is calling for Johnson to step aside, which is just honestly, they have what the NDP has done on China is absolutely stunning. How much they have aligned with the most reactionary, and quite, let's be clear, they could align with another reactionary force of the ruling class, the basically capitalists, and then and also I think a big chunk of the Chinese Canadian community that's uncomfortable with what's going on. But they are aligning with the most reactionary faction of the Canada's ruling class, the military industrial complex and intelligence agency in joining all this. But it's playing out, and it's going to play out more and more. Michael Chan, the former Ontario Liberal Party player, I believe he was a cabinet minister in a previous Ontario Liberal government, and now is the deputy mayor of is it Mississauga? No, I don't think it's Mississauga. One of the Toronto GTA municipalities. He just launched a lawsuit. He's suing CSIS and the I think global news guy Sam Cooper for basically running his name through the mud on this foreign interference business. And CSIS has been going after him since 2010. Right, this is 13 years they've been going after him as alleged Chinese agent, and so he's pushing back on that. Now, one of the things, Le Journal de Montréal had this 2-page investigation report. I think it was in Friday or Saturday's paper, and it was like titled "Des liens très étroits entre Johnson et la Chine." So close links between Johnson and China. And they listed like 8 or 10 different things, links between him when he used to be a chancellor of one of the universities, and he went to China, and some of his daughters studied in China, and he met the Chinese president, and a series of things like that. And I believe they were all of what they announced are true, but I guarantee you, if someone did the exact same thing on Johnson's ties to the U.S., they would find that he's met with a number of U.S. presidents. He's been to innumerable different U.S. universities. He speaks the same language as the Americans. He watches American television shows, and on and on and on and on and on and on about his ties, close ties. He vacations in the U.S. and on and on and on to the U.S. And so this is the climate, right? This is the climate, and again, the NDP has totally jumped into this. The Toronto Star had a op-ed, something I was not unfamiliar with, Bill C-26, which is giving the Communications Security Establishment, which is essentially Canada's NSA, Canada's main part of the Five Eyes. CSIS is also part of it, but the CSE is the main part of the Five Eyes. They're giving this article is unprecedented access to our private information without any commensurate increase in accountability or transparency, or any safeguards to ensure our information doesn't end up in foreign hands. So this bill is apparently giving the CSE more power, and this op-ed goes through how the CSE just ignores the oversights. Only recently they actually had an oversight. They ignore it. They've provided Canadian intelligence to the NSA or Canadian, information to the NSA, et cetera, et cetera. And, this gets to the whole, this whole question of, like, what's a bigger threat to our democracy? What's a bigger threat to Canadians' privacy? Is it TikTok, or is it CSIS and the CSE? Is it China, or is it CSIS? What's a bigger threat to our democracy? And I think the evidence is that it's the CSIS and the CSE, that these intelligence agencies that are totally integrated in the US empire. And you can make an argument that all these leaks are in fact a form of US interference in Canadian politics. So this is, I think, a part of this whole question. Obviously, we have to be looking at when we talk about foreign interference. Now, finally, again, I want to show this clip. I asked that I don't have asked the Veterans Affairs Minister at an event. I walked into this press conference very late. It worked out well. I walked in very late to this press conference, and I got in the room. They opened the door. They buzzed me in. Sometimes when you go late, it works. But the Veterans Affairs Minister had already spoken, so it was towards the end of the press conference. And then I always try to move as close to the front as possible, because if RCMP get to you, or if security get to you, you want make it as difficult for them to be able to get you out, right? They don't want to drag you out when you're like close to people, and it just makes their life difficult. So then I got close to where the media was, and then an RCMP agent came next to me, and so I immediately walked up right to the front and sat down on a seat, and then the RCMP agent stood right next to me. And as the other speaker ended, I sort of sat there, and I kind of made life difficult for the RCMP agent. And at a certain moment, I basically made a quick move around, and I got back around to the other side and got myself right next to the Veterans Affairs Minister, obviously with the RCMP agent following me. And I asked the Veteran Affairs Minister if he was concerned about the fact that Canada was supporting a US's geopolitical competition with Russia in basically using Ukrainians as cannon fodder, fighting to the last Ukrainian. And he responded, Macaulay's his name, the minister. He responded by just saying, we're just trying to support democracy in Ukraine. And then when I tried to follow up, the RCMP agent took me out of pushed me out of the room. But it showed how he doesn't really have any response. It's just sort of talking points of it's all about democracy, which is obviously a complete and utter farce. If you look at Canada's undermining of democracy, many different countries around the world. So on the NATO proxy war, there's been a number of developments. I'm sure some people saw Lindsey Graham, the Republican senator. I don't know if he's still the head of the Foreign Relations Committee, but he was previously, I think. He's in Kyiv, and he's on video speaking with Zelensky, and he says the Russians are dying. It's the best money we ever spent, right? So he's just like all this U.S. arms is great because Russians are dying. This is a good deal for us, and really clearly reinforcing the idea. It's, fight to the last Ukrainian. Hey, so long as you're willing to die, we're willing to give you the weapons to weaken a geopolitical competitor. The Wall Street Journal on Friday had a front page article that was really just, a horrible, sad story, really, about who they taking these poor rural Ukrainians, the Ukrainian military, pressing them into fighting. Guys, they basically said they got like 24 hours of weapons training, and they were thrown right into Bakhmut. This is the Wall Street Journal, okay? These are guys that some of them were like 50, and they had like ailments, like back, like they, serious physical problems. And they had maybe some of them had military training like 25, 30 years ago, but they had basically just literally taken from rural areas around Kharkiv, put into Bakhmut, and they quote this one saying something to the effect of I'm scared of guns. This guy saying it to his commander, and his commander saying, "Don't worry, Bakhmut will teach you. I don't know how to fire a gun. I'm scared of them. Don't worry, Bakhmut will teach you." And of course, most of these people were killed, and they quote their spouses and stuff like that. This is what's going on. It's just it's horrible. And I saw someone posting on Twitter pointing out, I don't know if it's true, but I see the logic to it, that the Ukrainian military is pressing people more in the Russian speaking and ethnically Russian areas, and less in the west of Ukraine. And they're basically arguing that it becomes almost like a ethnic cleansing kind of dynamic internally within Ukraine. If someone's going to be used as cannon fodder within Ukraine, better off being sort of like Russian-speaking people who die than, I don't know, more sort of Western Ukrainian, more sort of nationalist Ukrainians, if you like. And then also people pointing out that this always goes with every war, that wealthier people and politically connected people, their children, their sons are not being pushed to the front, right? They can continue as life is more or less normal in Kyiv. So obviously there's a class dynamic to who's being put into the front lines. So also Anita Anand, defense minister, announced more Canadian weapons, 43 AIM-9 missiles, and I think it's 20 million or 20 some odd million more in Canadian weaponry to Ukraine. They also announced a augmentation of Operation Unifier, a small augmentation of training Ukrainian forces in Poland, and that, of course, Operation Unifier, I won't get into it, but Operation Unifier is what put Canada into a low-level proxy war with Russia back in April of 2015, where Canada started training Ukrainian forces fighting other Ukrainians in the east of the country who were being backed by Russia, not as much as we hear in our media, but were being backed by Russia. And then that basically began a low-level proxy war that Canada, US, Britain were engaged with Russia, that the Russians, of course, amplified massively 15 months ago. And the Lula was quoted again, Brazilian president, doubling down, repeating the same point, more or less the same point. He said, quote, "A group of countries of the South, China, Indonesia, India, Brazil, willing to discuss peace, which quote, the North, US, EU is not able to do. So there's a part of the world that wants war and a part that wants peace." So again, Lula basically criticizing Canadian policy of arms, no talk about negotiations. And this is a position, as I detailed in a piece, and I delved into a little bit last week, but I flushed it out a bit more in a piece on my site. There's no one in the House of Commons, no MP in the House of Commons challenging Canadian policy, while there are in Britain, right? Jeremy Corbyn has made good statements, sensible statements. In the European Union Parliament, Claire Daly, Mike Wallace, Irish MPs. In the US, the head of the Green Party, Donald Trump, and factions of the right of the Republicans. In Canada, there's no one. There is no one of any MP, basically no one of any prominence in the country challenging. And the narrative in the media is just completely one-sided. And yesterday, I witnessed it. I was quite honestly stunned by this event that Montréal pour la Paix, a new Montreal peace group with Laurel, one of the people, a regular on Canadian Foreign Policy Hour, was a lead organizer for. And it was an event that initial iteration of it back in April was blocked at the Saint-Saint-Pierre, this sort of community union organized community organization, union kind of aligned community center wouldn't have an event. They banned their event. They blocked it. And then we moved to this new venue, and they took the payment, and then they canceled the event. They banned the event 5 or 6 days ago. And this is a community center that organizes the Anarchist Book Fair. And it just so happened the event was organized the same day as the Anarchist Book Fair was held. Last 2 days, the Anarchist Book Fair, Saturday, Sunday. The event was organized for the Sunday at 2 p.m. while the Anarchist Book Fair was happening. So they can have the Anarchist Book Fair, which would include some literature that calls for like armed insurrection, I believe, and to their credit, that the community center would have the event, Anarchist Book Fair, but they can't have a talk about peace in Ukraine. And what was absolutely unbelievable that happened yesterday, so we did the event outside in the park, and there was 20 people maybe that showed up for the event, but there was about 30 of these Ukrainian, presumably Ukrainian nationalists who came to disrupt the event. And what was remarkable is they basically chanted, made noise, were extremely aggressive for a full hour. They did everything they could. Fortunately, there was a sound system, but all three speakers, myself, a professor from the University of Montreal, and Alex Terrell, the head of the Green Party of Quebec, we had to basically yell into the microphone, and the speaker had the speaker amplified. And on a couple of occasions while I was speaking, a dude went over and like turned off the speaker and ended the noise. I have been involved in a number of events where there's been on Palestine, where there's been efforts to disrupt, on Venezuela, where people have come and yelled and whatever, on even the previous on the NATO proxy war, a couple of events in Ottawa, and there's been protests. Whatever. I've never witnessed that level of, quite honestly, well organized and belligerent sort of a disruption of, quite frankly, like, this is not disrupting ministers and politicians with any power. This is disrupting a group that is so marginalized, a perspective is so marginalized, that these left-wing community centers that are willing to host the Anarchist Book Fair won't even allow to book a room. And so I think these Ukrainian group, probably Ukrainian Canadian Congress, that organized this disruption, their basic position is they control almost all of the media sphere, and they don't want any hint of organizing that challenges this dominant narrative, and they came in force to disrupt it. And honestly, the people at the Anarchist Book Fair, to their shame, one or two helped out to kind of like push back against the aggressiveness. Overwhelmingly, they just stood aside and let this really belligerent force push back. Now, you can have sympathy for what's happening to Ukrainians, and I do have sympathy. I have sympathy for people who, express Ukrainian nationalism in the context of being attacked by Russia. But I'm almost certain, if you scratch the surface a little bit of these people who showed up, that you'll find that these are very fascistic people who have quite right-wing views on a whole bunch of different issues. And the fact that they go to during the Anarchist Book Fair, and there's not sort of like any sort of to basically shut down a peace meeting. The fact that there's basically no pushback from the hundreds of people who were there is, in my opinion, a kind of embarrassing comment on the Anarchist Book Fair. And a huge number of cops ended up showing up. There was I heard somebody told me there was 10 cop cars. I don't know. I saw more than 10 cops that were there. Someone told me there was 10 cop cars that showed up. It was pretty remarkable kind of thing. I'll leave it at that. Unfortunately, I only have about 10 minutes because it is I have a hard out at 7 o'clock. Laura, I've made you a co-host, and if you see hands, go ahead.
Okay, I actually don't see any hands up. I think tonight You might be able to make it out, Eve. I don't see
Okay.
any actual hands up.
If I don't know if Laurel's here, but if Laurel wants to add any little bit about
Oh, yeah, she put her hand up. Okay, Laurel.
the organizing of the event, and
Yeah.
go ahead, Laurel.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the couple of things. They're better disruptors than we are. They really tried to shut us down, and we persisted. We continued to the end, and we feel good about that, and we're going to keep on doing this stuff. And if they come out again, we're going to try to talk to them. We're going to try to figure out why they're being so obnoxious. But we're going to keep on going. We're going to keep on doing this because, as you say, nobody else is doing it. One of the things that somebody pointed out afterwards was that none of the people who disrupted us seemed to be able to speak French, and the event was in French. And they barely spoke English. They must not have been able to speak English, because when you were talking, Eve, and you were saying that you respected the right of Ukrainians to push back against the Russians, their response was shame on you. They said shame on you for that. So they didn't even understand that you were saying something that was on their side. So it was a really peculiar situation where we're being yelled at by people who didn't understand what we were saying, but who were just yelling at us anyway. They were out there to shut us down.
You have two more questions.
And I think
by the
that
way.
they were obviously emboldened by the fact that the community center shut us down. They were emboldened by the fact that two different community centers have canceled the event, right? And
Yes.
so, and they not only do they have all the media behind them, they have all the politicians behind them.
All
They have,
the
you know,
the
they
government.
on top of that, they have like left-wing community centers that are you know, shutting us down. And so, and they basically
felt free. Yeah, felt free to just say whatever they wanted and do whatever they wanted. Yeah.
Okay, Jake Javanshire and Christina Berra both have, Krishna Berra and Tanya B. So Jake, do you want to unmute, please? Jake Javanshire, can you unmute?
I can't actually see Jake.
Well, he's there. Jake, are you able to unmute? I guess he can't. Can you?
Might be able to, you might be able to unmute him, Laura.
Okay,
I
let's see.
can't see where he actually is.
Huh. I can only ask to unmute him, but
Yeah, you can ask
Oh,
unmute him and then he has to-
Okay, no, it wasn't doing it. No
Uh.
matter how many times I clicked on it. The only thing I wanted to say is that a couple of days ago, I read an article from RT, Russian TV news, that it comes into my email that so far 3.5 million Ukrainians crossed over to go into Russia. Can't really know how much of it is true or not, but obviously there is something into it that so many, it says, they went there and not the opposite way.
Oh yeah, I mean, that's been clear. This isn't new. I mean, first of all, Russia has the biggest Ukrainian diaspora, right? And that's continued on with, and that's a statistic that you hear almost never in the dominant Canadian media. You hear a lot about Poland, you hear about, you know, wherever. And I think like the full number, I'm not sure, but it's like, you know, the 3.5 million into Russia is like about a third or a little bit more than a third. I think it's something like 8-9 million that have left the country. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot implicit in the fact that people go to Russia. And, you know, there's obviously lots of, I mean, the story I was reading today about Ukrainian forces quoted in one of the big media outlets, Ukrainian forces fighting in the East, and everyone who stays like hates them. They're all pro-Russia, right? So everyone who's staying in Eastern, you know, close to the front line now, they're all pro-Russia. And this has been pretty obvious for a long time. We don't hear, very rarely do we hear that in our media. because it goes against the fact that this is much more complicated than this simple, good guy, bad guy kind of dynamic. Yeah, so go ahead, JJ.
It's actually Krishna Bera, actually, who's
sorry.
next. Krishna, can you unmute, please?
Okay, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, so one quick note, Thailand just had a general election and their US funded opposition got power and suddenly changed their policy to basically adopt the US policy on toward China, which completely reverses Thailand's policy. So I don't know if you want to follow that story in the future, maybe do some check into it. My question is more about how much foreign influence is there in Canada from the US, like the NED and the USAID? Do they actually, or is there other US organizations that specialize in Canadian regime change or guidance, I guess?
Well, I mean, very concretely, I've mentioned this one many times, the Uyghur Rights Advocacy Project, which is the group that got the Canadian Parliament to pass the resolution in 2021, calling it a genocide. They are funded by the National Endowment for Democracy for their work on Canadian Parliament. That they announced that openly. And they actually were created by the American Uyghur Rights Project, or I forget the exact name, which also was funded by the NED. They were sort of an offshoot. If you look at like the Disinfo Watch of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, that Marcus Kolga guy, who heads that Disinfo Watch, they stated openly on the website that the US Embassy in Ottawa and the US State Department funded them for their disinfo initiative. The disinfo, of course, is not American, it's Russia and Chinese disinfo is what it's all supposed to be about. So now also look at the parliamentary, this is the global parliamentary China coalition that Heather McPherson, the NDP foreign affairs critic, and Samir Zuberi are part of it. And I came at it by looking into Samir Zuberi, the Liberal MP, who's a former, I was in the Concordia student union with him. And he's part of this group. And this group, I'm reading through the site of this basically anti-China coalition of parliamentarians around the world with many Canadians on it, reading through it, and right at the bottom, who is it funded by? It's funded by the US National Endowment for Democracy, George Soros's Open Society, Taiwan Foundation, Taiwanese government, Taipei founded foundation. And so, this is clearly influencing Heather McPherson in NDP position. Now, I don't believe that I think the CIA is obviously molding Canadian politicians and doing some of that stuff, and that is taking place, and we don't hear about, and right there, some of this stuff is just open, like the military, all the top chiefs of defense staff as of in 2018, 2019, there's an article that showed the last like 5 chiefs of defense staff that came military. They'd all been trained in the US, right? They'd all been to that, mostly in that, I forget what it's called, the Texas Academy for like high-level officer training. So that's a very concrete example, and many Canadian military like that. But I do think they probably do also, the American CIA, State Department, embassy do work on Canadian politicians to mold them as, long-standing allies and stuff like that. But the main thing is much more, it's happening at, I think, at a more generalized level, be it cultural, political, media, economic, kind of generalized level, than that, direct NED funding, though that is happening as well, and, direct training of military officers or whatever, though that is also happening as well. But I think it's happening kind of at the broader political, economic, cultural kind of level, probably most importantly. So.
Okay, Eva, I don't think you have 2 more questions, but I don't think you have time because you have a hard stop.
Okay, so just one last question. And
okay,
and then...
Tanya B. Tanya. Oh, sorry. Can you unmute Tanya? Tanya, can you unmute, please?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. Tanya, are you there?
Yeah.
Hi. Okay,
Yeah, so,
great.
hi.
Go ahead.
Hi. So I'm one of the Ukrainians who were trying to shut up your event, and I do speak English. Je parle français et je parle russe, and I speak Ukrainian. And so my family is currently in Ukraine. Some of my family members are fighting on the east. Some of my very close friends are volunteering and bringing supplies to Ukrainian armies. And yeah, I would like to ask you, what's your involvement with Russia? And you were on Russian TV, and were you ever get paid by Russian propaganda in order to spread this misinformation about what's going on in Ukraine?
Okay,
That's
that's not your question. Okay, we want a short
I'll
question.
answer
We've got a
I'll
hard
answer very
stop.
quickly. I have never received a penny from any Russian anything, and I don't speak Russian. I have been on RT. I've been on RT since before. I've been on RT going back, I don't know, first time maybe 7, 8, 9 years ago. I've been on RT about Canada's role in Haiti. I've been on RT, I don't know, a dozen times maybe. I've been on Iranian state TV. I've been on Chinese state TV. I think I've been on Turkish state TV. I've been on Radio Canada, CBC. I've been on different outlets. As I've said, I think Russia's invasion is illegal and it's brutal, but I think Canada provoked it, and Canada's played an important role in prolonging and worsening the horrors. And I also think there's a whole history of Canada promoting NATO expansion and a certain type of anti-Russian Ukrainian nationalism that is being used to basically, target a geopolitical competitor. And I think that's devastating for, first and foremost, Ukrainians. And I think we should be doing everything we can to try to get a truce and peace negotiations to end the horrors. Unfortunately, I have to end because it's 7 o'clock. I'm very sorry, Jackson. But yeah, anyways, good night, everyone. Thanks everyone for coming out. Same place, same time next week.
Thanks,